Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Jeff Klausner from UCLA and the GloCal program. This is one day this year I'm not driving in my car. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce our speaker today and let you know this is our last GloCal Career Development Seminar. And remember, all these presentations are posted on the website. The presentations in past years are posted as well, future years too. So as you continue to be part of the GloCal alumni, you're welcome to look up these presentations and reach out to the speakers. All our speakers have a long history of mentoring and support for young investigators, and we've chosen them both as a combination of their research prowess and their interest in continuing to mentor and support, particularly people interested in international research and global public health. So today we are quite fortunate to have with us as a speaker today from University of California, Davis, the professor and interim chair of psychiatry, and he's going to introduce himself a little bit further, but he did originally obtain his undergraduate degree at University of California, Berkeley, and then went to medical school at Tulane University in New Orleans, and then completed his residency in psychiatry, University of California, San Francisco, then a postdoctoral training in research and clinical epidemiology, Robert Wood Johnson's fellowship at UCSF, and then a National Institute of Mental Health, NIH postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard. And then he's going to talk to you further about his career path and his trajectory thereafter. So without further ado, Lanson Hinton.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's great to see so many people here on the webinar, at least here in California. It's this morning. And I'm really excited to share with you, I guess some of the scientific work that I've been doing globally. But what I'd also really like to also emphasize during the presentation is some of the things that have been very important to me in developing my career kind of in this area. And so I'll go through some slides that present the work we're doing in Vietnam. And then at the very end, sort of come around to some of the really key lessons learned and also challenges that I've sort of faced along this path. But I wanted to begin, and thank you for that introduction. I wanted to begin by just telling you a little bit about how I got involved in sort of global mental health and aging. So one of the most important things to me in my career, I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, and during my residency training, I became very interested in research. I was actually at UCSF and did a research track. But what I realized is that my training as a psychiatrist really didn't give me a lot of time to learn some of the basic skills of research. And so what I did is to do 2 postdoctoral fellowships. And those have turned out to be immensely important to me in a couple of different ways. I was a Robert Wood Johnson clinical scholar at UCSF. And there I really learned about doing clinical research, about clinical epidemiology, really learned some of the basics of doing clinical research. And then I went to Harvard, and at Harvard I did a very deeply sort of interdisciplinary program that really tried to bridge medical anthropology and psychiatry. It was there that actually my mentor, Arthur Kleinman, who's a very well-known person in the field of cultural psychiatry, I worked closely with him. And I think that was really important because I spent a lot of time kind of hanging out with medical anthropologists and sociologists, psychiatrists. And it was really stimulating to think about different mental health problems, but from very different disciplinary perspectives. and also to learn, to complement what I'd learned in the Robert Wood Johnson program, which was around quantitative methodology, to learn about how to do qualitative research methods and how to sort of incorporate that into my work. So I think those 4 years were really absolutely pivotal in providing a foundation that I could build upon to do, the kind of work that I'm doing now. So to come, sort of spring forward to nearly the present, but about 10 years ago, I had not done any global mental health work. And my mentor from Harvard, Arthur Kleinman, was out at UC Davis doing a talk. And we sat down and I was talking with him about my, career development at UC Davis. And he said, Ladson, he said, I think a really important thing for you to do would be to get involved in global mental health, because that's really the cutting edge of cultural psychiatry. And so then I got actually a very small grant from Harvard, from the Harvard Asia Center, to go to Vietnam and to begin to develop the work that I'm going to talk about today. So the two important points, kind of take-home points, I guess, at least for me, from this brief, description of my path to global mental health is, one, the importance of that training, that interdisciplinary training, both at UCSF and at Harvard, and also the incredible importance of mentoring. And so Arthur Kleinman was very important to me sort of early in my career, as I was getting going in geriatric psychiatry and mental health. And then much later, so about 10 years ago, he really sort of mentored me again and helped me get launched in global mental health. So today I'm going to talk about some work that we've been developing for nearly 10 years. And it really focuses on developing interventions, community-based interventions to support family Alzheimer's caregivers in Vietnam, actually specifically in Hanoi, which is where I'm working now. And as I'll tell you, is our work has sort of expanded from an initial set of studies to really identify and adapt an intervention. And now what we're also trying to do with some additional grant funding is developing a network of researchers around Vietnam. So I wanted to begin by because I know that people probably have varying levels of familiarity with just the concept of dementia. I just wanted to very briefly talk about what it is. And when I'm teaching residents here at UC Davis, I like to say that they're really kind of, when you evaluate an older person, you kind of need two different things in order to, identify or diagnose somebody with dementia. One is you have to have evidence of cognitive decline. By cognitive decline, it's memory, but it could be other things like visuospatial abilities, executive function. And so you have to have some cognitive decline. And then you have to have functional decline so that person is not able to function independently, not because of some other medical problem, but as a result of that cognitive decline. So those two pieces result in sort of the syndrome of dementia in a very basic way. I guess that's how you could define dementia. And dementia is a syndrome. It's caused by a number of different degenerative brain diseases. Alzheimer's disease, vascular disease, Lewy body disease. And so it can be caused by one and often by multiple different degenerative diseases in the brain. So people with dementia often have a combination of Alzheimer's and vascular disease, for example. It's not caused by delirium or depression. And importantly, the symptoms of dementia are cognitive and functional, but often they're also behavioral and neuropsychiatric. So things like depression, anxiety. So why is this important in low and middle income countries? Well, this is actually a graph it's from the Alzheimer's Disease International, from the World Alzheimer's Report. And basically what it shows is the growth in the number of people with dementia. The number of people with dementia in both high income and low and middle income countries. And so what you see at the bottom in the purple is basically the number of people worldwide with dementia in high income countries. And on the top, it's the number of people in low and middle income countries. And what I think you see quite dramatically is that, whereas now in 2015, about where we are now, the number of people with dementia in low and middle income countries compared with high income countries is about the same. It'll look dramatically different by 2050. So there's really a huge increase in the number of people with dementia that's occurring now in low and middle income countries. So it's a really important public health issue. But not only does dementia affect the person, who is, the individual who's living with dementia, it also has a huge impact on families. Families provide the bulk of care. It's associated with a high economic cost. Caregivers have to actually sometimes give up their jobs to take care of the person with dementia. Caregivers themselves are at risk for things like depression, poor self-care. In studies, family caregivers of people with Alzheimer's are often rate their health poorly. And as I've seen from my own work, they often will delay their own medical care because of the demands of caring for somebody with dementia. The other thing I'd like to really mention here that's really important throughout the world, and this definitely is true for low and middle income countries, is that the bulk of family caregiving to older people with dementia is done by women. And we have seen this in our work in Vietnam. So this is something that is really heavily gendered in a way in terms of just the demands that it places on the family. One of the things that's most difficult about dementia are the dementia-related behavioral problems. So these are as common as cognitive symptoms in people with dementia. In other words, a person with dementia will have cognitive impairment, but they almost always will also have behavioral issues. Those vary in severity, but they are very, very difficult for families. They're the thing that's probably most highly associated with caregiver stress and burden. So there is, a reasonably strong evidence base now of interventions that support family caregivers and that are effective in the US and even with multicultural populations. I would say they're kind of modestly effective and we still have more work to do, but there's definitely an evidence base, strategies, interventions, programs that can really help support family caregivers and reduce their stress and burden. So one of the things, yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought somebody had a question. There's a little bit of an echo there.
Yeah, that's me. That's me.
Oh, okay. So one of the really important things to do when you're starting off in a research area, like we were, is to actually do a review of the literature. And so what we did this review as we were preparing our first grant application. And what we wanted to see is we knew there were a lot of interventions for people with dementia and family caregivers in the US, psychosocial interventions that had been shown to be effective, but what had been done in Asia? And so we looked in Asia and we did a scoping review of the literature. And what we did is we identified throughout Asia, and we took a very broad view of including multiple different countries, both high income, middle income, and low income countries. And we found that there were about 32 interventions that had been conducted. And but the other really dramatic thing is that we found that almost all of the evidence for caregiving interventions in Asia had been done in high-income countries. And so that's what's illustrated here on the left part of the slide. You can see that there were 28 studies we identified that had been done in high-income countries, and often most of them had actually been done in China, either in Hong Kong or mainland China, and also Taiwan. And then just a smattering of studies from other areas, but very few studies had been done in lower middle income countries and low income countries. And there hadn't been any work done actually in Vietnam, where just like other low and middle income countries in Asia, they're experiencing a dramatic increase in the number of people with dementia. And so, there's obviously a huge gap that on the one hand, there is growing number of people with dementia, and dementia takes a real toll on families, and yet very little had been done in terms of trying to develop programs to support community-based programs to support family caregivers. So that led, background, so we got into the literature and we decided to, what we would do, and this is actually another really important point, is how we got to this point of doing this R21 grant through Fogarty and NIA is, it took about 4 or 5 years to both find the right collaborators in Vietnam. And the other really important thing for me, and I always like to tell this story, is that I actually, when I started out my work in Vietnam, I was actually doing work on late life depression here in California, trying to develop interventions and disseminate interventions for underserved populations. And so I went to Vietnam, and I thought I would do exactly the same thing there. That I would basically take, it's a model of care for depression that's called collaborative care, where you integrate sort of the care for depression into primary care, which is very relevant to countries around the world. But that's what I thought I would do. And I went to Vietnam and actually gave a talk at the National Geriatric Hospital. And there were quite a few people there. And afterwards, the director of the hospital took me up to his office, and he said in his very, very polite sort of Vietnamese way, he said, "That's very nice work that you're doing on collaborative care and on depression." But then he paused and he looked at me and he said, "But what about dementia?" And as it turned out, the National Geriatric Hospital had been had high on their priority list developing community-based supports for family caregivers of people with dementia. And this was also a priority in the government. And so this was really an important moment, because what I had to do is shift from what I had taken to Vietnam in a way as sort of on my agenda and what I thought was important. And what I did is shifted from that and then really, collaborated with them to develop this line of research. So the point is that really this research was prioritized in country by my collaborators in Vietnam, and it aligns with their agenda. And I think that's been very important to the sustainability of this work. So we got a small grant, an R21 grant from Fogarty and NIA, to basically to take an evidence-based intervention, to adapt it, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, and then to do a pilot cluster RCT. And so the process of intervention development is, we kind of began with part of what I told you about, a literature review to see what had been done. And then in Vietnam, with this R21 grant, we actually interviewed different groups of key informants, and to get their perspective on sort of the lived experience of dementia caregiving, about what was important for family caregivers in the community in Vietnam, and also to just ask them about an intervention model that we had identified that had been used in the US, to talk with them about whether or not they saw that as being relevant to the needs, and to be a good fit with Vietnam. And so then, once we identified our intervention, we then went through actually a pretty lengthy process of adapting it. And before jumping to the pilot cluster RCT, one thing that we hadn't anticipated doing, but that we ended up doing, and I'm so glad we did, is we did a pilot case series. So we basically developed the intervention, and then we pilot tested it in about six family caregivers. And we learned a lot from that. We learned a tremendous amount from that, and it was extremely helpful in making our pilot cluster RCT, I think, more effective. And one of the great things about doing work with the team in Vietnam is that we were actually able to over-recruit. So we had initially planned a pilot cluster RCT to test feasibility with about 30, and acceptability with about 30 families. And then we ended up actually doing a study of 60, and we expanded from just a regular RCT to a cluster RCT. And as I'll show you, we have some nice data around preliminary efficacy. So I'm just going to mention here the intervention that we're using in Vietnam. It's called the REACH model. And there have been several sort of iterations of that here in the US. It's one of the most widely used interventions to support family caregivers who are taking care of people with dementia. And we chose a version of that that had been developed actually for the VA system and had been expanded also by other groups to different culturally diverse populations, called REACH VA. Sort of a multi-component intervention. It involves educating caregivers about the nature of dementia, helping them develop skills to manage behavioral problems. It helps them to develop an approach to managing problems through problem solving, and also includes a component that's around stress reduction. It is about 4 to 6 sessions. Actually, in Vietnam, it's taking us about 4 sessions, occasionally 5 or 6, that are delivered over 2 to 3 months. It's usually delivered in the home. In this RCT, it was delivered by nurses and physicians from the National Geriatric Hospital. And again, we had all of the manual and everything was translated into Vietnamese. So this is sort of a snapshot of sort of what we found. So we went and, this is our protocol paper. And so we basically found in our cluster RCT that the intervention group compared with the control group. In our study, the control group it was sort of an enhanced control. So they certainly got a little bit more than you normally would in Vietnam, which is a little bit of education about dementia. But that's all they got. That group compared with the group that got the REACH, we call it REACH Vietnam intervention, that the REACH Vietnam intervention group had, the caregivers had their depression was improved. That's the PHQ-4. It's actually a mix of depression and anxiety. And they also expressed less burden. So we had a burden scale that's commonly used in the field called the Zaret Burden Inventory. So we saw some really nice, robust, effects for the two of the main outcomes of this study, which was really nice to see and created a nice basis for, expanding the study. So what we're doing now is we took the data from our R21 as pilot data, and then we applied for an R01, and that's what we're doing right now in Vietnam. And so the R01 is sort of expanding this, REACH Vietnam intervention study to basically 32 clusters and about 350 family caregivers. It's actually right outside of Hanoi in Vietnam. And what we're also doing in this next study, this next cluster RCT, is embedding the intervention more in the community. And what I mean by that is that rather than using interventionists from the National Geriatric Hospital, who are, sort of the cream of the crop in a way in terms of, really, many of them had experience with research and pretty highly trained. What we're doing is we're actually, in this next cluster RCT, we're going to be using interventionists from the local community. And so that's an important sort of step in moving interventions, from sort of efficacy towards effectiveness and eventually to dissemination. We're doing a process evaluation. I could talk a little bit more about that later, in which we're not only going to be sort of implementing this intervention, but really trying to learn from the process of implementing and doing this intervention in the community about barriers and facilitators that could help to improve this in the future. And then the third thing that we're doing, which I'm really excited about, is we are developing here at UC Davis. One thing I've done over the last decade is I've actually run one of the Resource Centers for Minority Aging Research, or RICMARS, at UC Davis. I did that for about 6 years, which really it's funded by NIA, and it is a model of training junior faculty to help them develop their research careers. And I kind of took that model, but what we've done is to kind of embed that in Vietnam. And so we're creating a network of investigators there, and then identifying faculty and giving them pilot grants and pairing them with high-income country collaborators or mentors. So this is one of the final slides. I just wanted to introduce this. This is from the National Institute on Aging. It's called the Stage Model of Behavioral Interventions. And I think it's really nice because it shows kind of how you develop interventions, the whole process. And, we began with a stage, what would be called an efficacy sort of stage 2 cluster RCT. But now we're moving that more into the community. So we've moved to sort of a stage 3 efficacy trial. And that eventually we hope that, if this is shown to be effective, that we'll move pretty rapidly towards stage 4 and 5 and to disseminate it more broadly in Vietnam. But the other reason that I like this model is that it's not simply linear, that what may happen is that when you're doing, for example, an effectiveness trial, or even at the stage of dissemination and implementation or pragmatic trial that's no more sort of a stage 3 or a hybrid stage 3, stage 4, you may learn that there are things that are not going well with your intervention. And what you actually need to do is to go back to an earlier stage of intervention development to actually refine the intervention, to develop new components, to really develop a much more effective way of training interventionists. And so it's really it's a nice way of, I'd really encourage you to check this out at the NIA website. So this is the Vietnam Alzheimer's Research Network that we're developing. I won't say much more about that. We could talk about that in the discussion if you'd like. And I wanted to end with just a few lessons learned, some of which I've kind of touched upon in this presentation, and then open it up for questions and discussion. And so in terms of the things that I've learned that have been really important in developing this work, one is, probably the most important thing is finding the right collaborators. And I didn't really describe this earlier, but it took me, there were there were some dead ends kind of early on in trying to find the right people to collaborate with in Vietnam. And luckily, eventually, I did find really good collaborators who share a lot of the values, that I do around research. But it took a while. And so I think that was really an absolutely critical piece. The second is sort of aligning priorities across countries. And that sort of speaks to that story about meeting with the director of the National Geriatric Hospital up in his office and him saying, what about Alzheimer's disease? And so really it was about aligning my priorities with the in-country priorities and having the flexibility to do that. And I think that has been absolutely critical. I think that creating an interdisciplinary team, I did not show a slide showing our team, but our team is highly interdisciplinary. Our collaborators at the National Geriatric Hospital are from nursing, from geriatrics, from neurology. The co-PI of this grant with me actually has a PhD in social work. She is now also a Buddhist nun, and she lives much of the year actually in Thailand and spends a lot of time in Vietnam. And then here at UC Davis, we have a biostatistician who's part of the team. We have clinical psychologists. So it's a very highly interdisciplinary team. And I think that's been very, very important to our work. Going back to finding the right collaborators, the piece that I didn't mention, which is incredibly important, is finding Huong Nguyen, who is the co-PI of this grant, has been enormously, important and really central to the success that we've had, because she's often sort of boots on the ground, so to speak, in Vietnam, working with our team. The other thing that was really important is strong pilot data, and I talked about actually getting the R21 grant. And an R21, if you're not familiar with it, is sort of a pilot grant that you get to develop pilot data. But usually when people apply for pilot grants, they have some pilot data to begin with. And so one of the really important things we did to prepare for getting the R21 is we actually went out, I went out into the field in Vietnam to our proposed field site, and we interviewed a few caregivers. I met with colleagues there. And so we actually had a little bit of pilot data in our R21 that I think really demonstrated to reviewers that, we really had a serious, collaboration, a very real collaboration across the US and Vietnam. And I should also add that now our team includes a pharmacist who is in Australia and now is also part of the team. And he's sort of developed a a parallel grant to develop a national Alzheimer's plan in Vietnam. So we sort of have this line of research going, but now we also have him as part of our team, and he has this grant funded by Australia and the Vietnamese government to basically help them develop a national plan. And the final thing I want to mention is just the importance of thinking ahead to sustainability and ways to have policy impact. And that's something that we're constantly doing. And I think we still have a lot of work to do in that regard. But I think always kind of looking ahead to hopefully having a more sustained kind of impact is really, of the work is really, really important. So I'm going to end there. I think it's about a half an hour, and sort of open it up for your comments, questions. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dr. And that was wonderful. And I really appreciated, the kind of beauty of your slide set and be able to take, a complicated topic and a relatively, few slides kind of lead us through the project there. So if people want to put up their questions in the chat mode, then Lucia and I will kind of moderate those. But I want to open up with a question going back to your early career and your transition under the mentorship in the Harvard program to finding your first academic position. What was kind of your process there, and how did you go through finding a position? What was your first role, maybe as an assistant professor? How did you balance the demands, research, clinical, etc.?
Sure. That's a great set of questions. One thing that was really, I struggled a little bit to find my path in academics, during those postdoctoral years. And actually what was really, really important to me is having the opportunity it was actually at the tail end of my my postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard, to become part of a team that submitted a grant to the National Institute on Aging, which was actually a kind of a small center grant to focus on ethnic and cultural issues in family caregiving. So at that point, at the end of my postdoc, I was not a geriatric psychiatrist. My training came later. But it gave me an opportunity I was not the PI of that grant, but I was a co-investigator. But I was really, I learned a huge amount from working with the senior people on the team in writing that grant. And then we were fortunate enough that the grant got funded. And so that was actually incredibly important, because I was sort of a project coordinator on an NIA-funded study and could really learn from the more senior people about how to do research, how to write grants, how to carry out a project. So I would say that was really a seminal experience for me. And the other thing that was really important about it is it kind of launched me into the field of aging. And I said, hey, I really like this stuff. And I decided that clinically, I wanted to work with older patients. And so that sort of triggered, my getting training in formal training in geriatric psychiatry. So I would say all of that is, those are some really important pieces. So what I always try to tell junior faculty who are sort of getting started is what can really be effective is kind of the apprentice model, which is really working with a good research team and learning how to write grants, how to do research, rather than trying to do it all solo, which can be done, but is just much more difficult. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have a question from Lucia, who asks about the dynamics with global funding and research and the challenges there. The question's about, have you been able to continue your research through COVID-19, or how has that affected your research? And do you see any changes in funding and priorities in country that might affect your work in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just in terms of, I've been very fortunate with the grants that both of our R21 and our R01 were funded on sort of the first round. And I think we had really strong applications, again, because of the strong pilot data we had for each of those. With our R01, we are, fortunate also that we're not at the stage of actually having launched our R01, the cluster RCT in the community. And so we're monitoring very closely with our colleagues in Vietnam, sort of the situation there. And at this time, we're not actually anticipating that we're going to have to sort of modify our approach. We'll have to see how things develop. In Vietnam, they've had reported a remarkably low rate of sort of death from coronavirus. And it seems like the country has been able to control things, pretty well. But, we'll have to see what happens over the next couple of months. In a lot of this work with family caregiving, what people are having to do is to adjust their approach by, say, doing things over the telephone or sort of telehealth, doing the interventions kind of remotely where that is, feasible. So, because of course, older adults, family caregivers, and older adults are, quite vulnerable, really vulnerable sort of population for this in terms of this virus. I'm involved with another project that is similar in some respects to the one in Vietnam. It's also taking an intervention, an evidence-based intervention that's actually focused on the older adult with dementia. It's an exercise intervention that has been shown to reduce sort of dementia-related behavioral problems and reduce caregiver stress. And I'm a co-investigator on it's an NIMH grant, and it's in Thailand. And there this has been much more disruptive because they were actually out in the field. They had recruited a whole bunch of people and were about to launch, had done training of the interventionists and were about to launch the intervention, and they had to halt everything. And they have gone through a process of trying to figure out whether or not it's still feasible to do this in person, whether the intervention can feasibly be, delivered, remotely, telephonically, or in some other way through iPads. And they've decided that they really need to do it face to face. And so they're monitoring things closely there. And it looks like, they may be in a position to actually get back into the field maybe in June or July. Our study's been delayed. We had planned to be out in the field in June. Instead, now it'll probably be August, September. But I say we're in reasonably good shape, knock on wood. But who knows? These are very uncertain times, and one has to be flexible and also really think about really carefully sort of the ethics of this in terms of exposing, vulnerable populations to increased risk from COVID, et cetera. So we're taking all of those things into consideration. Great question.
Excellent.
I hope I answered that.
All right, excellent. So I have the questions are rolling in. This is a question from Monica Diaz. She says, great presentation. Have there been any advances in implementing policies to increase resources for caregivers or people with Alzheimer's through the Ministry of Health?
That's a great question. Not yet. But what we have had, I've had conversations with both. We have collaborators who are part of the Ministry of Health. And I've also met with members of the government in Vietnam. And one of the reasons I was very excited about doing this project is I met with a gentleman who is a physician, who's actually the head of one of their, in the National Assembly, one of the committees that actually develops kind of social policy, which includes things like caregiving, et cetera. And I have a picture, it's not in this slide deck, but of the two of us meeting. And he basically said, this is really an important priority for the government. And if you can develop an intervention and show that it's effective, we will scale it up. And so I guess the answer is that right now there isn't a lot that's in place, but both with this project and hopefully the evidence that we generate and through our collaborators, we hope that we'll have an impact. I'll say the other thing is that's been very exciting is to collaborate with Dr. Nguyen in Australia. And, he has, I mentioned the grant that he got, which is co-funded by Vietnam and the Australian government, in which he's actually doing a needs assessment to develop a national Alzheimer's plan for Vietnam. And so that's certainly, if that comes to fruition, that will have, I think, a real meaningful sort of impact. So we're actually have had we've had the first two national dementia conferences in Vietnam and brought together policymakers and also researchers, et cetera. So we're very hopeful, but there's nothing really concrete to report at this stage. I think, what I've learned is that in terms of policy development, it's been an education for me to just learn about how policy happens in Vietnam and to try to think about the best strategies for actually impacting policy. So one of the things that we have done in our Vietnam, the national network that we're developing, is we have included as stakeholders in the development of that network a branch of the Ministry of Health, the head of it, who is involved in sort of research initiatives for the Ministry of Health. And so she's a part of our network. Her family has been affected by, Alzheimer's disease. Her mother had Alzheimer's disease, and so she's very kind of invested. So, I guess that's sort of a long-winded sort of answer to a complicated question: is how do you eventually have sort of policy impact? But so we're still working at it. But so stay tuned. Maybe have me back in a couple of years. Maybe I'll have more to report. But
All right,
thank you,
thank you.
Monica. Thank you, Monica, for that question.
All right, now we have another question actually from Vietnam. We have a fourth-year University of California, Los Angeles medical student currently working in Vietnam on some HIV and mental health related topics, named Keenan Withers. And Keenan is currently in Hanoi, and he's interested in a career in academic psychiatry and global mental health. And Keenan asks if you feel that NIH funding for global mental health research is more difficult compared to other fields in global health that NIH funds, things like infectious diseases or HIV specifically, and what your thoughts on the future of global mental health as an academic career, and then more specifically related to your research studies. Were any changes in your R01 application related to the formative work you collected during your R21?
Okay, wow, it's a set of really good questions. And, I guess the answer to the first question about, global mental health and funding, I think there's growing recognition that, mental health is really central to health overall, and that they're interconnected. And that mental health is incredibly important, across the world. So I think that there really is a bright future for people going into sort of global mental health. I will say that one of the things that's really important in writing grants and getting funding is to kind of do two things I think in sort of the global work. One is to demonstrate that you're addressing a problem that has really high public health significance, that is really prioritized in country. I think that's absolutely critical. But the other thing that's important to do is to demonstrate to NIH that what's going to develop out of the research that one is going to conduct will advance science more broadly. And so just to give an example, our R21, we used that pilot data to inform the R01. So the R01 is based, builds directly upon, the R21 study that we did. We're using the same intervention, et cetera. But one of the things we had to do in the R01 is to show, and I had actually a conversation with my program officer there, and she said, that you've got you've got some nice outcomes, et cetera. But she said NIA is really interested in mechanisms of the intervention. And so what I mean by that is that, if say you want caregivers to feel less burdened or say less depressed and anxious, what is it that, you've got an intervention that's based on sort of a theory, but what's the mechanism of that? Like what are the intermediate variables that maybe are impacted that result in someone feeling less depressed or anxious? And so what we had to develop in our R01 application were some hypotheses around mechanisms. And so I think that was really important to NIA. So I guess the take home from that is that it was really important to consult with my program officer at NIA about our grant, because I think that really helped us eventually to kind of get the funding. So I think those were, I'm not sure if I covered all of your questions, but hopefully at least some of them.
Okay, and then yes, and then he also asked, where specifically outside Hanoi are you working?
Yeah, we're working in Haizuong, which is sort of just, I want to say north of about 30 to 45-minute drive north of Hanoi. So first, our pilot study, our R21, was done in Saksun, which is by the international airport there. It's technically within the Hanoi city limits, but it's a sort of semi-rural area. I chose, this is important too, but we chose those areas because the National Geriatric Hospital has done a lot of projects with groups in those two different areas. And so they do a lot of work in Haizuong. And so we decided that that was really optimal in terms of doing the R01. Another thing that we've done that I think has been really important in developing the work is, and it's really nice that the grants from Fogarty actually encourage this strongly, is we have had our collaborators from Vietnam come to UC Davis and then also go to NIH for networking meetings through Fogarty. And so we brought, actually there's a gentleman who's going to be, he's a psychiatrist who is at the provincial hospital in Haizuong. And so he actually went to Bethesda. I got to know him, and he seems very engaged, and so that's been important to try to develop those relationships. So hopefully that'll help once we get to the point of implementing our R01.
Okay, well, I will open up the microphones if anyone wants to ask a question. Oh, here we have one. Okay, excellent. This is from Williams Reynoso, Dr. Reynoso from Peru. He says, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Are we prepared to mitigate or anticipate any impact of COVID-19, particularly because it impacts elderly patients on patients with dementia?
That's a great question. And certainly, older adults, and particularly older adults with medical problems are, medical comorbidities are at high risk. I have not yet seen any data on, people who are living with dementia and how they're affected by COVID, but I would imagine, based on some of the data from nursing homes in the U.S., that they are at high risk, and we'll find that they are, they're definitely a very high risk population. So I think we're learning about risk. I don't know that we're really learning yet about how to kind of mitigate that, except to control very carefully sort of who has access to nursing homes, and to try to do much more testing to really identify, who is infected, but it's a huge tragedy in the U.S. I mean, and I think that if you think about nursing homes, I mean, that's where a lot of people are being affected, and they're probably in a lot of nursing homes. I would say probably 50% of the people who are living in those facilities have dementia, and so I think we'll learn a lot more about it, and it's both tragic, but really, I think, also an important opportunity to try to learn and improve things, both for the present and also to prepare for the future. But thank you for that really important question.
So I have a question, and then we'll probably wrap up unless there's some additional comments or questions. But in terms of like the epidemiology and frequency and distribution of, institutionalization and assisted living or nursing home settings in Vietnam versus at-home care, how is that changing over time, and generally what does that look like? Where do people with dementia live and get their care?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The vast majority of people with dementia live at home with their families until they die. And that is changing gradually. There is a movement um, to develop nursing homes in long-term care facilities in Vietnam. Uh, those are, there are a couple of them, for example, in Hanoi, and certainly in a few of the other major cities as well, but they're very few. But I think it's a growing industry, if you will. And there isn't really much between sort of that institutional setting and home care in terms of assisted living, et cetera. I think all of that, if you look at a country like China and how it has developed very rapidly, a number of assisted living and sort of other things, I think you'll see that sort of rapid development in Vietnam as well. I will say that one of the reasons we're doing this work in Vietnam, we're doing this program to support family caregivers, is because currently the vast majority of people with dementia are cared for at the home, through with family caregivers, and also because I think ultimately that's the way we can help prevent institutionalization. And I think for some families, that's probably, the best option, but I think we can do really important things to help give family caregivers the skills and resources they need to be able to do this in a way that doesn't compromise their own health and well-being. So again, I think we're going to see rapid change in Vietnam over the next 10 years. And hopefully, in addition to developing, assisted living and, more long-term care facilities, we'll really see a strengthening of that community-based support for family caregivers. And again, that's what we've really been trying to push, in Vietnam. So thank you for that question.
All right, outstanding. Well, I think we're going to wrap up our presentation today. That was really wonderful and right on target and exactly what we all wanted to hear, this combination of career track and decisions and this journey that we're all, or at least many of us, are at the beginning of, and then how it's combined with fascinating research and implementation of projects. So thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing more about your results in the future.
Okay, and thank you all for the wonderful questions, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions in the future.
All right, take care.
Okay.